He said they didn't scream, not at first. That's the line that kept echoing in my head as I stood there, watching investigators unseal the basement door of a seemingly normal house on the outskirts of Seoul. It was a detached home, faded paint, weathered siding. Nothing about it screamed horror until they opened the hatch. The cult member who said that line wasn't shaken. No remorse. His voice was calm, like he was describing a recipe or telling a story he'd told 100 times. And what haunted me wasn't just the words, it was the pride in his tone. Like he thought we'd understand, like we might even agree. He said the first ones, the early ones, he called them froze, stared, too shocked to make a sound. The second group, they begged, pleaded, tried to offer money. One even prayed, but none of them screamed immediately, and that's what he remembered most, the silence. When the steel door finally groaned open, I stepped inside, and I swear the air hit like a punch, thick, metallic, like the room had been holding its breath for years. No windows, bare concrete. The walls were lined with dull, riveted steel, the kind you'd see in a ship's cargo hold, not a basement. Chains hung from my hooks bolted into the ceiling. There were scrape marks on the floor, long ones, a small drain in the center. Every sound in that room echoed with the weight of what had happened there. And then I saw them. Tucked in the far corner, behind an overturned stool, photographs, not old, not aged, crisp, printed recently. There were dozens of them, scattered like someone had dropped a deck of cards. They weren't labeled, no dates, no captions, but each one told a story that didn't need words. Some were surveillance shots targeting a person walking into an apartment, someone sitting in a cafe, a man pumping gas, oblivious. Others were different. Blurred images inside the very room I was standing in. Victims mid-sentence, eyes wide. Some bound, others staring straight at the lens. I could tell the lighting hadn't changed much since those photos were taken. One of the detectives, a veteran with over 20 years in organized crime, stepped outside and vomited. Another refused to look through the rest. I didn't blame them, because this wasn't just a basement. This was a ritual space designed not just to detain, but to transform human beings into something else entirely. Something that fit their worldview. Something they thought the world would thank them for. And as I looked around that room, a single thought crept in. How many people walked by this house, never knowing what was buried beneath their feet? Before we get lost any deeper in the darkness of that room, I need to take you back. Because monsters like this, they don't just appear, they're shaped, fueled, and sometimes they build each other. It started with one man, Kim Gi-H1. Now, if you looked at his records, you wouldn't think twice. He was a small-time entrepreneur, ran a few businesses, nothing big. All of them failed. Some say he lost everything to bad investments. Others say he burned bridges faster than he could build them. But that's just the surface. Beneath it, a mind consumed by rage. Not loud, fire-starting rage, but cold, festering resentment. The kind that grows in silence when someone thinks the world owes them something. And when it doesn't deliver, they turn. He believed society was broken, not just unfair, poisoned. He claimed the wealthy didn't just succeed, they stole from everyone else. That the rich were parasites, and it was time to cleanse the host. And that word cleanse, he used it often, with pride, like he thought he was a surgeon, like the world was sick and he was the cure. But he wasn't content with talking. He wanted believers, soldiers. He found them one by one, not in dark alleys or backstreet bars, but in places you'd never expect. A security guard, a former truck driver, a quiet housewife with no criminal record. All of them had something in common: grievance, against bosses, landlords, politicians, against anyone who had more. And Kim, he offered them more than revenge. He offered purpose. They didn't call themselves a cult. They called themselves family, the Chijon family. But this wasn't built on love. It was built on control. Obedience was absolute. Disloyalty, not tolerated. One former member barely escaped claimed that questioning the mission meant becoming the next target. They lived together, ate together, trained together. Kim gave lectures, wrote pamphlets, repeated their ideology until it became muscle memory. They studied targets, ran drills, built codes. They weren't reckless. They were organized and terrifyingly convinced they were righteous. This wasn't about money or chaos. It was about cleansing. And I could already see how far they were willing to go. They didn't stumble into violence. They engineered it. Buried beneath one of their safe houses, under layers of concrete and deception, they constructed what they called the room. Not a jail, not a cell. This was something else. A soundproof, windowless chamber, sealed with a reinforced iron door. No natural light, no outside noise. The air inside didn't move. Everything about it was intentional, calculated to isolate, disorient, and wear down whoever was brought there. They installed chains on the walls, bolted metal rings into the floor, a single flickering light overhead, surveillance equipment, old analog gear pointed inward like unblinking eyes. There was even a drain built into the center of the floor. For what? I didn't want to ask. But I had a feeling I already knew. They weren't just containing people down here. They were shaping them, breaking them apart piece by piece until whatever remained was no longer a person, just an example. Kim Gi-hwan once described it as a classroom. That still haunts me. Because what were they trying to teach? And who did they think was listening? Her name was never supposed to be remembered. She was a university student, bright, focused, loved by her friends. She wasn't rich, not really, but she dressed well, carried a designer bag, took cabs instead of buses, and in the twisted minds of the Chijon family, that was enough. She was followed home from class, watched for days. They mapped her routine. Then one night, she didn't come home. At the time, it was treated like a disappearance, a runaway maybe. Police found no signs of a struggle, no witnesses. Her dorm room was untouched. Her phone was off. It went cold almost immediately. But now, I know where she went. They took her straight to the room. She was their first test subject. According to recovered writings, they believed the first would set the tone for all the rest. Her suffering, documented, measured, analyzed, was meant to become their blueprint. One cult member later said, "She never begged, just stared. That's when we knew we picked wrong." No remorse, no hesitation, just analysis. And now I wonder, was she even alive when they left that room, or was that always the plan from the start? For a long time, the public had no idea what was happening. The news covered the stories, sure, but they didn't connect them. How could they? On paper, the cases seemed random, isolated. A middle-aged man disappears near a toll booth on the way home from work. No skid marks, no wreckage, just his empty car pulled over neatly on the shoulder. A woman vanishes after meeting someone for a blind date at a shopping mall. Her phone stopped pinging an hour later. Her friends assumed she got cold feet. Her family knew better. And then, weeks later, a body was found, drifting in a narrow, forgotten river far from Seoul. No ID, no wallet, nothing to say who they were, just what had been done to them. The public shrugged. Tragic, yes, but not suspicious. People disappear all the time. That's how the Chijon family stayed hidden. They didn't strike twice in the same way. They rotated methods, varied locations, staggered timelines. Every move was rehearsed, every act served a purpose, and every victim handpicked for what they symbolized, not who they were, what they represented. Success, privilege, power. The cult's ideology wasn't just spreading, it was operational. And then came Kim Jong il. No, not that Kim Jong il. This man was a wealthy South Korean executive in the import export business. His company specialized in high end electronics. His Instagram, yes, he had one, was full of watches, cars, private golf courses. To the Chijon family, he was the perfect embodiment of what they hated. He wasn't just rich, he flaunted it. Luxury sedans, designer suits, dinner reservations that cost more than some people's rent. And even worse, he was predictable. He took the same route home every evening. Same time, same streets, same security routine. They tracked him for a week, and then they acted. It wasn't a struggle, it wasn't loud, it was surgical. On a quiet, sloping back road through the outskirts of Seoul, they blocked his car with a decoy vehicle. One stepped out, pretending to check a flat tire. Another approached the driver's side with a stun device. Within seconds, he was gone. No screams, no alarms. His car sat idling with the door open, like he'd simply stepped away. And by the time anyone noticed, he was already in the room. They knew exactly where to strike. That road was barely lit. No traffic cameras, no witnesses, just a stretch of crumbling asphalt that cut through a wooded industrial zone, one of those in-between places where the city ends and nothing really begins. Kim Jong-il never saw it coming. The decoy car angled across the lane just enough to make him slow down. By the time he leaned out to ask if they needed help, two of them were already moving in, one to distract, one to disable. In under a minute, his car sat empty, still running, driver's door ajar, interior lights casting a pale glow on the blacktop. By the time a passerby called it in, hours had passed, and Kim Jong-il was already gone. But I didn't fully understand the horror of what happened next, not until I saw the evidence with my own eyes. It wasn't just a disappearance. It wasn't just a killing. They documented it, all of it. Dozens of photos, labeled, archived, like a twisted scrapbook. His arrival in the room. The moment he realized it wasn't a robbery. The change in his posture as the hours passed. These weren't trophy shots. They were something else. Study material. They took notes. They analyzed reactions. They treated human suffering like data collection. And the most disturbing part, he was still alive in nearly all of them. But this wasn't senseless brutality. No, the Chijom family had a system, a doctrine. Each act was guided by what they believed was a greater truth. That modern society had been hijacked by the wealthy, and that they, the forgotten and discarded, had the right, the duty to take it back by any means necessary. They saw their crimes as cleansing rituals, not random, not chaotic, calculated, sacred. Kim Gi-H1 had written a lengthy manifesto. It wasn't scrawled nonsense or the ramblings of someone unhinged. It was chillingly articulate. He quoted philosophers, referenced history, even used corporate language like this was a startup, and he was pitching investors. One line stuck with me. We are the virus for a sick world. What we consume, we purify. That word consume was used more than once, and suddenly all the missing pieces began to shift into place. This wasn't just about hate. It was about transformation, about proving something to a world they felt had erased them. And Kim Jong-il, to them, he was just another offering. I still remember the board. It was mounted on a concrete wall inside the cult's hideout right next to the surveillance monitors and an old fold-out table stained with cigarette burns and what looked like dried paint. Or maybe something else. I didn't want to know. At first glance, it looked like a messy hit list, but it was worse. There were names dozens. Full names, some underlined. Beside them, occupations, car models, watch brands, places they shopped. The handwriting was neat, careful, like someone had taken their time. And at the top, 2 words written in bold red ink: the rich list. But these weren't politicians or celebrities. They were teachers, mid-level managers, small business owners, ordinary people who, to the Chijon family, looked like they had too much. That's all it took. They weren't targeting enemies. They were staging symbolic executions. A warped performance to send a message the world never even realized it was receiving. And the scariest part, some of the names on that list were already crossed out. The truth wasn't uncovered through strategy. It wasn't the result of a long investigation. It was an accident. Late one night, 2 patrol officers flagged down a beat-up van for a busted tail light near the edge of a rural district. Routine stuff, no weapons drawn, no suspicion. But inside that van was the crack in the cult's armor. Fake IDs, multiple wallets with different names, plastic sheeting, a length of rope, and tucked in the glove compartment, a single-use disposable camera. Nothing digital, no phone, no social media trace. But those printed photos told a story that no one was ready for. The first image was blurry, a man tied to a chair, eyes open wide. The timestamp was smudged, but the background matched the walls of the room. Another shot showed a woman's handbag on the floor, contents spilled out. Her ID was among the items found in the van. She'd been reported missing 3 months earlier. And just like that, the puzzle pieces started snapping into place. The van was impounded. The photos were processed. And the raid on the cult's compound was launched within 24 hours. The moment that film developed, the line between missing persons and serial executioners dissolved, and the Chijon family's nightmare was finally dragged into the light. The raid came just before sunrise. Authorities knew they had to move fast before the cult disappeared again, but this wasn't a simple operation. The compound was hidden deep in the wooded outskirts, disguised as a storage facility behind rusted gates and scrap metal walls. Inside, it was a fortress. Steel-plated doors, reinforced hinges, booby traps, some rudimentary, others disturbingly sophisticated, wires rigged to homemade alarms. One section had been barricaded entirely with stacked furniture and sandbags like they were preparing for a siege. And in a way, they were. The Chijon family didn't surrender easily. They fought, some with makeshift weapons. One tried to set a fire to cover their escape, but it didn't work. After hours of coordinated breaching, 5 members were finally subdued, zip-tied, hooded, dragged into daylight for the first time in weeks. One of them, the youngest, made a run for it, vanished into the nearby trees. For a moment, it looked like he might slip through, but the forest wasn't on his side. He got tangled in brush, left a trail. Police found him crawling through mud, barely conscious from exhaustion. And that's when the real nightmare began. Because what they found inside the compound, journals, photos, a ledger of names, and a locked cabinet filled with items that had belonged to their victims like trophies neatly organized. That escape attempt had failed, but it cracked the cult wide open. In custody, they didn't cry. They didn't ask for lawyers. They didn't even flinch when shown the evidence. Instead, they talked. Openly, like lecturers delivering a final class. not out of guilt but pride. One said, "We were building a better world." Another added, "We didn't kill, we cleansed." Their tone was flat, their eyes hollow, but beneath that emptiness was something worse: conviction. They believed in what they'd done. They felt justified. One officer told me later, "It was like listening to someone explain how to assemble furniture, only their instructions were about taking lives." The interrogation tapes weren't emotional. They were methodical, cold, calculated. They detailed timelines, logistics, how targets were chosen. They even corrected police when they got details wrong. At one point, a detective slammed his hand on the table and shouted, "Do you feel anything?" And the cult member simply smiled and said, "Yes, accomplishment." I kept coming back to the same question again and again. How did no one see this coming? These weren't shadow-dwelling maniacs or people scribbling manifestos in isolation. They lived among us. One worked security at a government office. Another delivered packages. One woman managed a small neighborhood convenience store. Customers remembered her as polite, even kind. They paid bills, shopped at markets, hosted family barbecues. To outsiders, they were just quiet, struggling folks trying to get by. But underneath that ordinary surface, they shared one burning thing: a hatred, not just for wealth, but for what wealth symbolized: control, corruption, injustice, the belief that success could only come at the expense of others. And somewhere along the way, that hatred had curdled into something far darker: justification. They didn't just fantasize about revenge, they built an infrastructure around it: the jobs, the homes, the normal life that was all camouflage. The real work happened underground in shadows behind locked doors. And by the time we finally saw them for who they really were, it was already far too late for some. But then it got worse. During trial preparations, one of the cult members, under heavy guard, asked to speak privately with an investigator. And what he said chilled everyone in the room. He claimed there were more victims, not just the ones tied to the bunker, not just the ones confirmed through photos or ID cards. More. He rattled off names: people who were never listed in any missing persons database, places that had never been searched. Victims, he said, that didn't need documentation. His exact words: "Some sacrifices weren't meant to be found. That's what made them pure." He refused to give full details, claimed the names were for the cause, not the court. Authorities scrambled to follow up. Every name, every location. But most of the places he listed were vague rural fields, abandoned buildings, unnamed stretches of road. Nothing concrete, nothing they could prove, and to this day, those leads remain cold. But the thought has never left me. How many others were there? And how many might still be buried somewhere? Their stories never told, their names never spoken. Prosecutors didn't hold back. They knew this case had rattled the country to its core. The Chijon family's actions weren't just crimes, they were ideological executions, planned and carried out with a level of detachment that disturbed even veteran investigators. So when the trial began, there was no room for leniency. The prosecution demanded the harshest penalties allowed by law, and the court agreed. Each member received a heavy sentence, decades behind bars. Some were handed life terms, others near enough. There were no gasps in the courtroom, no outbursts, just silence and the quiet unraveling of families on both sides, victims and perpetrators alike. Because this wasn't just a murder case, it was a mirror held up to society. And when people looked into it, what they saw terrified them. Neighbors asked how they'd missed the signs. Parents locked their doors tighter. Talk shows debated whether this was an isolated tragedy or a symptom of something spreading under the surface. And one question echoed everywhere. Were there others like them, still out there? After the final verdicts were handed down, the authorities wasted no time. The bunker, the heart of the nightmare, was demolished. Nothing was salvaged, no plaques, no markers. Just rubble where evil had once lived. But not everything could be erased. Some evidence was sealed permanently, especially the photographs. Only a small number of officials ever saw them. No copies, no digital files. What those images captured was deemed too disturbing even for the public record. And maybe that was the right call. Because as much as we needed the truths, some truths never stop echoing once you let them out. Even now, I think about that basement, the chipped siding, the rusted fence, the porch light that flickered like any other suburban home. Nothing about it warned you what was inside. But beneath that shell, the room waited, silent, sealed. A place where ordinary people, driven by extraordinary hate, carried out unthinkable things. And somehow, no one noticed. It makes you wonder, is evil always hiding in the dark? Or has it just gotten better at pretending to be normal? So here's what I'm left with. What happened to the victims they never found? We have names, hints, locations, but no resolution, no closure. Why did so many people follow Kim Gi-hwan so blindly? Was it desperation, ideology, or something deeper, more primal? And is it possible someone else out there still believes in the mission? A copycat, a survivor, a sleeper waiting to pick up where the others left off. Because if we've learned anything from this case, it's that the line between justice and horror is far thinner than we think. And sometimes the scariest monsters are the ones who look just like us.